Sugarland Baptist Church, where we're doing our Wednesday night pastor's Bible study. Really, for the next 3 months, we're going to be using this time as kind of some supplemental instruction on our effort to read the Bible through in 90 days. If you're new to us and you haven't heard about this yet, you can go to our website and you'll be able to click on the events page and click on the greatest story ever told, the Bible in 90 days. It has a reading plan for you. There's 3 reading plans. You can read the Bible cover to cover. There's also one that is a little bit shorter. You can read some key passages every single day. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes. And especially if you join in now on that one, you could catch up. It's certainly possible to do that. Or you could just jump in where we are and read the parts of the Bible that we're going to be talking about this evening and forward. And so last week we covered really kind of an introduction in the book of Genesis. Tonight we're going to look at Exodus and Leviticus. I realize it actually may be helpful in the future to try to get a little bit ahead so that we're giving an introduction to some of the books you will be reading instead of the books that you've already read. If that's helpful, if that would be helpful for you, one of the things you might could do is pick up a couple of one of the resources we have here at church. This is called the Essential Bible Companion. We have paperback copies here at the church you can get for $10. It's essentially an introduction to each book. It has a brief outline of each book, kind of gives some key thoughts in each book. In fact, some of the material I'm presenting tonight is out of this. You can also get this on your Kindle. So it is, the Zondervan is the publisher. That'll probably help you find it. The Essential Bible Companion. If you wanted to get more information than that, this is going to be very similar to what you have in a good study Bible and the introduction to each of the books of the Bible. But if you'd like more, about a year ago, I picked up this textbook. So this is what you would pick up if you were taking an undergraduate Old Testament survey class. This is a very new edition, so it's very updated. In fact, some of the same authors have penned both of these books. Excuse me. It's called A Survey of the Old Testament. The 2 authors are Andrew Hill and John Walton. And it really is a good resource. It's a big book. I know it feels intimidating, but it's actually pretty easy to read and use. And so if you wanted even more information, like you're reading the book and you want to learn more about the Ark of the Covenant, or you want to learn more about the Tabernacle, this book would have that. So we're going to jump into it. Exodus, excuse me, which one of the downfalls of what we're doing? There's holes. If you're covering the Bible in 90 days, there's really no way to cover everything on Sunday morning. And the giant flaw in the sermons that I'm preaching is I'm not actually going to preach out of Exodus on Sunday morning, which really is a travesty because it is difficult to understand the story of the Bible without understanding God rescuing Israel in the book of Exodus. I'm sorry for the coughing. I know in this season it's almost terrifying when somebody coughs. I had a service earlier today, and so I've already preached once today, so my voice is feeling it a little bit. But the key themes in Exodus are this. It is really about God connecting with his people. So the book of Genesis ends in a little bit of a cliffhanger. Joseph and his family have moved to Egypt. They were not slaves at that point, but then the book of Exodus opens up that there came about a Pharaoh who did not remember Joseph. And the growth of the Hebrew people in Egypt has become a threat, and so he enslaves them. And so then the book of Exodus really becomes about God's rescue and provision for his people. It teaches us that we have a God who reveals himself. There in the burning bush, God makes himself known to Moses. Moses did not go looking for God. God came looking for Moses. That's really a theme throughout the Bible. Christianity, based especially on Judaism, is not a religion where people go looking for God. It is a religion and a faith where the primary story is that God has come to look for us, that he reveals himself to us. God is a God who rescues his people. We see this in the Exodus, the actual deliverance from Egypt. God is a God who provides for his people, both physically and spiritually. We see that in their wilderness wanderings, he provides the quail and the manna, but also spiritually, he provides the law and the sacrifices that provide for them their sins to be forgiven. God guides his people. So in the book of Exodus, he does that literally by really resting upon the tabernacle when he wants them to stay. But when he wants them to move, there's a cloud by day and a fire by night that when it moves, that's the presence of God leading his people through the wilderness. He also guides them with the law. It teaches them how to live. And then God chooses people. Kind of a secondary theme in this book is that God chooses people for holy work. We certainly see that in the calling of Moses, that God calls Moses out to a specific task. In the priest, God chooses priests to serve his people in his name. And then even craftsmen who are going to construct the tabernacle. And that's really not just, we think of special craftsmen. He really calls on all sorts of different people, leather workers and goldsmiths and all sorts of folks who contribute their work to the tabernacle. So these are really the key themes of Exodus, and they play out over and over again. If you're going to do a really simple outline, it would be in 3 parts. In chapters 1 through 12, you have Israel still in Egypt. And of course, you have Moses talking back and forth with Pharaoh. You have the 10 plagues, and then you have the actual Exodus. And so then you have, after they leave Egypt, you have the journey from Egypt to Sinai. So this is the early days of wilderness. We wouldn't call it a wandering yet, but the wilderness travel. And they go to Sinai, where God gives the 10 commandments. And that would really be a third scene. So getting to Sinai is the middle part of the story. But then the rest of the book of Exodus is what happens there at Sinai, where God gives the law and makes the covenant with Moses. Now, Moses' covenant with God is a little different than Abraham's. We talked last week about how the covenant God made with Abraham was unconditional. So God was the only one really making promises in that covenant, and Abraham didn't have to do anything. The covenant with Moses is conditional. God is promising to do something for these people if they will obey his commandments. So he has chosen them. In his grace, he's chosen Israel, not because of anything they've done, but in choosing them, he nevertheless wants them to behave in a certain way. And your main characters in this story are going to be Moses, of course, which we almost all know, his brother Aaron, which it's hard to remember that Aaron actually does all the speaking for Moses because Moses has a stutter. There's Miriam, who is Moses' sister, and she plays an important role, in fact, even prophesies at one point. You have Jethro, his father-in-law, which gives him some wise advice one day about not trying to do everything himself, but electing other leaders who can help serve the people as well. And then Zipporah, his wife. Some key verses are this. In Exodus 3, when God reveals himself to Moses, he gives Moses his name. I am who I am. The Hebrew there carries with it really, I will be who I will be. I am who I am. It carries multiple tenses. It's this mysterious name, but God is asserting himself really as, the one who has made all things, the one who has always been, the eternal one. Chapter 14, verse 31. The Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed. That's really what this is about. God delivers his people from Egypt, and they see that he is powerful and good, and that he has delivered them from who was the most powerful person on the planet, Pharaoh. People could not understand any other way that he was the most powerful person on the planet. Then you have, if you will obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all of the nations you will be my treasured possession. 19 verses 5 through 6. So there you see the conditional nature of this covenant. Now, just because this one's conditional doesn't undo the promises God made to Abraham, but it does help us to understand that their presence in the land is going to be conditional on them keeping the covenant. And so you have that, if you obey me, then I will do these things. And then, of course, I love 34:6. We get one of the first descriptions of God describing himself, and you'll see this passage show up again and again. In fact, in our reading just a couple of days ago, it showed up again in the book of Numbers. I think it was actually today. It's part of our key verse for today. That was out of this passage. It was a repetition of this passage. He says, and he passed in front of Moses. So this is where Moses asked to see the glory of God. And God said, well, you can't see my face or you'll die. So I'm gonna pass on by. And after I've passed by, I'll let you essentially see the hem of my garment. Somebody called it the afterburners of God. He got to see the afterburners of God. And there the Lord says, after he passes by Moses, the Lord declares, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. This is God revealing who he is. This is God's self-description. And this passage will show up over and over again in the Bible. Then chapter 40, verses 34 through 35, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So what is really a key theme in the book of Exodus is that God is present with his people. In fact, the tabernacle we'll pick up in the New Testament because it was a sign of God's presence. God was there. He made himself manifestly known in the tabernacle. In the New Testament, in John 1, we are told about the Word becoming flesh, and he dwelled among us. That word dwelled there is actually the same verb that is the word tabernacle. He tabernacled among us. So in the person of Jesus, we are getting really the same thing that we had in the tabernacle. We're getting the indwelling of God, that God is with us. Of course, in Christ, he's with us in his fullness. And so it's helpful when we read the Old Testament because it helps us to understand the New Testament in new ways. Now, we could spend all sorts of time talking through kind of the historical evidence that's there for the Hebrew enslavement by Egypt, for the Exodus. We don't have time for that tonight, but there's lots of resources out there for that. You could get a little bit of that in this Old Testament survey. But a lot of people wonder, well, when did it happen? And scholars obviously they don't necessarily know specifically. There's a couple of extra biblical references to people groups that sound like the Hebrews that have some scholars who argue that the Exodus occurred during the reign of Thutmose III, which was around 1445 BC. You have a lot of other ones, and this is probably the more traditional understanding, is that it happened during the reign of Ramses III around 1250 BC. And so you get that picture there, and if that interests you, you can shoot me an email, and I can send you some different resources about how to explore that study. The wonderful thing today with the internet, there are so many resources at your fingertips. In fact, one of the things that I subscribe to, it comes in very robust forms for pastors, but then lay people can also sign up in cheaper versions. And sure, people bringing me water. This is good. Karen can wave to all the people. Thank you, Karen. And so one of the things this is called Logos. It's just a computer program that has lots of different resources on it. And it has this wonderful picture of the tabernacle. And so you can see on this, the large square there, it's a little confusing. Up here in the corner right here is supposed to be an American football field. Now that makes it look like it's the size of an American football field, but it's not. The smaller square represents the tabernacle area. So the tabernacle is just a little bit less than half of a football field. And in it, you of course have, all of this was portable. So part of the picture in Exodus and Leviticus, and then into Numbers, as we're talking about the wilderness wanderings, is that God both leads and goes with his people. In the ancient world, gods were often associated with locations. So if you were in a particular place, you would worship the god that was associated with that place. And if you moved somewhere else, you would switch gods. That's just the way it worked because there was a new god in that new place. Israel is really, in the history of religions, the first one to say, no, there's not a lot of gods, but there's one God. And wherever we go, we worship the one true God. But since they were a people on the move, they needed to take the place of worship with them. And so you have very detailed instructions. And I know for modern readers, as we read the Bible and we read all of those instructions, it can be a little tedious, but it reminds us, one, of the importance of worship, that God wants us to pay attention to the details of our worship. And for us, that may not be in the construction of all the details of the building, but it does mean in our own lives, in our own hearts, we should take worship seriously because God is worthy of our worship. And so it doesn't mean we have to be sour. That's not what I mean. But it does mean worship should not be something we take lightly. That to worship God is really the highest calling on our lives. In the book of Exodus, in this, you start to get some of the themes that go with Jewish worship. And the book of Exodus really picks that up. So I guess we'll look here. You had some outer courts here that had tables, and that's where they would slaughter the animals. You had an altar out here where they would make the burnt offering. But then you could also go into the tabernacle, which was essentially a tent. And it had the first area, which was the holy. It was the Holy of Holies, and then or the holy place, and then the inside you have the Holy of Holies. So even smaller place where the priest was only allowed to go once a year to make the offering of atonement. So in the book of Leviticus, we have even more instructions for really what it looks like to worship and live as a Jewish person in that day. And so you have some key themes in Leviticus that help us figure out what was important in the Hebrew worship of God. The first theme is really holiness. You see this throughout the book. It's both that God is holy, but because God is holy, we are also called to be holy. It shows in the book of Leviticus the importance for the need of sacrifice. So this is where we are introduced to the idea that for sins to be forgiven, sacrifices must be made. But not simply for sacrifices, for sins, but even the idea of thanksgiving or gratitude, that in many of these ways, the way that we can show to God that we love Him and that we are grateful to Him is by offering sacrifices from our life. Then Leviticus also gives us this radical concept of sabbatical rest and the sabbatical year, even getting to the year of Jubilee. So this great emphasis that there should be one day a week, we do no work. There should be every 7 years, a year of rest, and then every 7 sets of 7 years, this Jubilee year where people are set free. And so all sorts of stuff that is so foreign to us, and really historically, a lot of scholars don't think that ever happened. And Bob Mariolaro was commenting on my blog where we're talking about this every day, where he had read that might have contributed to the exile. And we're actually going to talk about that in just a few weeks, how one of the ways of looking at the exile is looking at the fact that God's people never kept all of the law, especially this law about setting one another free and forgiving debts. And so God forced them to take a Sabbath rest in many ways through the exile. But that's getting ahead of us. We'll get there in a few weeks. So in Leviticus, if you have an outline, the first 10 chapters are really about when we come into worship, how do we approach God? And so it talks about all of the sacrifices needed and all of the steps needed to enter into the presence of God. Verses 11 through 25 deal more with ordinary day-to-day life, but still understanding that our lives are lived in God's presence. So how do we live in the presence of a holy God? And then verse 26 really talks about blessings and curses. This will pick up again at the end of Deuteronomy, which is really a repetition of the law. And so this idea of here's the law, and then God says, if you'll keep it, you will experience these blessings. And if you don't keep it, this is what will happen, that you will be cursed. It's not so much that God is out zapping them, so much as when we disobey God, the result of that is a life without God, which leads to all kinds of severe consequences. And then because, remember, this was a document for people to live by. And so as strange as it seems to us, there are other instructions in there in chapter 27 about what do they do if they make a vow or if they need to make a gift. And so this was a part of their lives. It's helpful when you're reading the Bible to remember it wasn't just written to 21st century people. It was written to people over the centuries. And so there are parts of the Bible that certainly seem strange to us, but would have been very relevant in the lives of others. Here's some key verses. Chapter 10:3, God says, I will show myself holy. That in all of this, what God is saying is, I am holy. I am righteous. And then in the next chapter, the reason he wants the Israelites to live in all these unique ways is so they'll be set apart from everybody else. That's what it means to be holy, to be set apart, to be different. And so he says, be holy because I am holy. Jesus quotes that verse in his Sermon on the Mount, that we are to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. And so, and then how do we do that? And chapter 18, verse 5 says, keep my decrees and laws. That God has given us these guidelines as a way of showing us what a holy life looks like. Now, a lot of those had to do with what we would think of as religious or cultic purity laws. So that's about what food you eat, about what clothes you wear, and those kind of things, about not mixing the garments. And all of those things seem really strange to us. Some of it may have been because those laws helped set them apart from their neighbors. So really we've lost to history what many of their neighbors' religious practices looked like. And so it's hard for us to know exactly how some of these things set them apart from their neighbors. But what we know is, in doing these things, it made them different from the other people in that land. And that helped set them apart as a people who didn't worship many gods, but who worshiped the one true God. So when you read some of the instructions, you think, I don't understand that. It's really okay that we don't understand all of it. The larger idea that they were to live in ways that were different than their neighbors is probably the most important theme to carry out. And really, buried into all of those strange rules are still some of the heart of God's desire for people, how they should live morally and righteously, that's carried through to the New Testament. In fact, in the New Testament, when a teacher of the law came and asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was, Jesus first quoted out of Deuteronomy that you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then he says, but the second is like it, and that actually comes from the book of Leviticus, Leviticus 19:18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. Throughout the book of Leviticus, we start to see God's heart for the poor. We start to see God's heart for foreigners, for strangers in the land. He tells them not to abuse strangers in the land because they were once strangers in Egypt. You get to see God's care for our own inward morality and character, that we are, he gives all the listing of all the, ways that we can sin sexually. But a lot of that is to put boundaries to say when we make a promise to our husband and wife, we're to keep that promise. God keeps his promises to us, and we're to keep our promises to one another. There are all sorts of laws about speaking truthfully and about not bearing false witness, that we're to live in ways that promote justice in the land and promote fairness in the land. And all of those things are things that God continues to want his people to do, even though in God's grace, and we've been really set free from the law that says you can't eat certain foods or you can't wear clothes that have two different kinds of fabric in them. And so I hope as you read Leviticus, or as you read Leviticus, and as you read really in the next couple of weeks Deuteronomy, and you see some of these laws repeated, to look in there for kind of those seeds that bear fruit later in the teachings of Jesus. Jesus' teachings are not different than the Old Testament laws. They are really taking portions of the Old Testament law and elevating them as the most important, as the way in which we live morally in the world. Now, a big part of Leviticus is, and I didn't do some proofreading up there, but so this is really first the festivals and the months. And so what's the calendar look like there? So if you're reading it and you're thinking through, well, what month is it actually talking about? Because it uses the Hebrew lunar calendar. Charts like this can give you kind of a comparison to where we are in our year. And I just because of having several funerals this week, I did not get these notes into that supplemental document, but I will do that tomorrow or at the latest Friday, so you'll have some of these resources available to you. But you can look through there and see kind of the calendar year. And for the Hebrews, really their whole year really turned on the agricultural season. And so they had a large rainy season, which was September through April, and that's where they plowed and they planted. But then beginning in about February, March, they moved into harvest season. And so a lot of your festivals are really connected to the harvest and offering sacrifices to God. So you have on the front end of their year where you're planting, and so there's lots of festivals there where there is seeking God's provision. And then at the end of the year, once harvest begins, are some of the other festivals which are giving God thanks for all of his provisions. And that's not totally unlike even our culture when it was more agricultural. Thanksgiving comes at the end of the year when harvest would occur and people would offer thanks to God. And so sometimes when you're reading through there, you can see how their year was organized. So the book of Leviticus definitely gives us this idea that the entire year, kind of shaped around the agricultural calendar, was used to teach people about God's goodness and God's provision. The other big thing in the book of Leviticus are all the offerings. And sometimes it's hard to keep them all straight. I know I'm listening to it this go around, and so listening about, taking the thigh or the breast and it waving it into the air as a wave offering to the Lord, it sounds really crazy to us. But they had kind of several categories of offerings. The first was the burnt offering. When they offered that, all of the animal was burned up to God, so nothing was saved. And it was to be a male without blemish, and it was the animal, the kind of animal was according to your wealth. So you needed to make a real sacrifice. So if you had lots of resources, it could be something as much as a bull. But if you were someone who was poor, you could even bring simply some pigeons or something smaller. In general, this was a propitiation for general sin. So this was a sacrifice, really as a way of bringing about the forgiveness of your sins. They had other offerings, though, that were more what we might call thanksgiving offerings. These are sometimes called a meal or a tribute offering. In this, they would only have a token, a really small piece of the offering that would be burnt to God, and the rest would be eaten by the priest. And this was usually unleavened cakes or grains, so not every offering was an animal. And this was for general thankfulness, very often connected to the first fruits. So when you harvest, you would take a portion of that, you would make some bread, and then you would offer that to the Lord as an offering. A peace offering, which came really in several different formats that I didn't break down here. It could be a vow, when you made a vow. It could be Thanksgiving, several other things. You burned up the fat parts of the animal, and then you shared the rest of it. You actually sat down and ate with the priest. So it was a fellowship meal with the priest. And so it needed to be a male or female animal without blemish, although it's interesting, if it was a free will offering, a slight blemish was allowed. When you read through that, it all seems a little more detailed than we're used to. But again, this would be simply as a time of fellowship, so it may be just a celebration that people wanted to get together and offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Maybe you had an unexpected blessing in your life, and so you wanted to give an offering back to God because of that blessing. Maybe you had a child, maybe something good happened, and so you wanted to make that offering to the Lord. It could be a vow fulfilled. So you made a vow to the Lord that you said, if you will do this, dear Lord, I will bring an offering to you. You see that in a lot of the Psalms. And so a lot of the Psalms were written in conjunction with a peace offering. And then just general thankfulness. People might bring thanksgiving offerings for any number of reasons. You had the sin offering, which also was burning up the fat of the animal. The rest of it would be eaten by the priest. This is interesting. If you were the priest or the congregation, they offered a bull as the sin offering for everyone. The king, though, in order to purify himself, offered up a he-goat. And an individual, if it was separate from corporate worship, would offer up a she-goat. This was for purification. This is really about not so much those sins that are moral failures, but really where, you touch a dead body or you do something that's not sinful, but in the Old Testament understanding, made you unclean for worship. And so you have to bring these purification offerings in order to be purified and ready to worship the Lord. And then the guilt offering. So if we think about that, the sin offering was really for those where something made you unclean. The guilt offering was really for a moral lapse, either the desecration of something that was holy or some kind of objective guilt. You actually sinned in a way that harmed somebody else. It didn't just make you unclean. And that's the same way, though. You burn up the fat on the altar. The rest is eaten by the priest. And then this one specifically needed to be a ram without blemish. And so you can see all of those are kind of given examples in Leviticus 1 through 5. Really a complicated system, right? So when we think about church, I know it can be a struggle to get ready for church on Sunday morning, but nothing compared to this, right? This is very complicated. But in the New Testament, we start to see when it talks about Jesus being the perfect sacrifice for our sins, we can't really fully understand that without understanding all of these Old Testament sacrifices and the role they played in Jewish faith. Well, that brings this time to a close. We're going to put a Zoom link up on the screen in probably the comments section. It takes me just a little bit to get over to my office, but Pastor Jeff will be sitting there waiting on you. And any of you who can join us and we just let you kind of ask your questions about this week's reading and just chat for a little bit more, just to get the most that we can out of this Read the Bible Through in 90 Days. It's been good to be with you. I hope to see you in the Zoom meeting in just a second.